Just before Advent, we were in Jerusalem, where Paul and his ministry partners have come to conclude their first missionary journey. They had traveled throughout Asia Minor, and Paul had found many Gentiles becoming Christians. And this raised some concern among the Jewish Christians who believed that these Gentiles should be circumcised, a significant rite of passage. They should become Jews on their way to becoming Christians, or at the very least that the conversion would happen at the same time. And Paul has come to talk this through with the people leading the church in Jerusalem, namely Peter and James. And so they have what has come to be called the Council of Jerusalem, Acts chapter 15. And as we saw at the very end of that series, just before Advent, that they finally did reach a consensus that Gentile converts did not also have to become Jews. And so with that assurance, with that permission, with that blessing, Paul sets out on what has come to be known as his second missionary journey. And you had this map in your bulletin. So you can probably read it better, but this gives you a general idea. He starts out at the very bottom, the west side of the map, the very bottom. He starts out in Jerusalem, and he makes his way back up to Syria, through Syria, back to Antioch, where he was first called into ministry, then on to his hometown in Tarsus. What we notice is that he doesn't cross and visit the churches on Cyprus this time. And then he starts this really wild trek throughout sort of the rest of Asia Minor and across into going towards Europe. So keep that map in mind. Because here's what Google AI told me about this journey. The Apostle Paul traveled approximately 2,700 to 3,100 miles during this second journey. And the trip lasted about 3 years, somewhere between 49 of the Christian era and 52 of the Christian era. So, and AI and its infinite capacity to do math faster than any of us can do math, that may be my best use for it. By land, it was approximately 1,795 miles. So he is walking, maybe riding a donkey, maybe riding a horse or a camel, but by land, almost 1,800 miles, across modern-day Syria, all of Turkey, and into Greece. By sea, it's estimated that he travels almost 1,300 miles, 1,290 miles, across the Aegean, crossing both the Aegean Sea and then back through the Mediterranean. So gives you an idea of what a trek this was, what a commitment this was. Had I been Paul and had such an enriching and fabulous and fruitful missionary trip, and I'd gone back to Jerusalem, where I had lived in a fairly sumptuous lifestyle because I was a serious religious in the Jewish community, I might have kicked the subletters out of my apartment and moved back in, and stayed in Jerusalem, basking in the glory of what I had been able to be a part of. But the Apostle Paul starts out again. And AI says the route started in Antioch. So he goes from Jerusalem back up to Antioch, and he visits some churches along the way. Then he gets to Antioch. He traveled through Asia Minor, crossed into Europe at Philippi, moved south through Athens and Corinth, and returned via Ephesus and Jerusalem back to Antioch. So you're looking at this on your map. You can see where we're going. And the average pace, given that they likely did stick to the really sturdy Roman roads, these roads they were sturdy. They're still, many of them are still in existence, whereas we can't seem to manage to repair our potholes after a mere, 30, 40 years. They built real roads, and Paul probably stuck to those. And they say a typical traveler would clock up to 20 miles per day. And then, just noting, it's almost twice as long as the first journey. And it's on this journey that he first crosses into Europe. So that just gives you a picture of how immense and significant this journey is. The first part of the journey has him visiting the churches that he formed on the first missionary journey in Tarsus, in Derbe, in Iconium, and Lystra. And from there, he then branches off. And so the question, as you listen to the text that Trisha's coming to read, where does he go? Where doesn't he go? And why? I am very curious in this text about the places that Paul doesn't go. Because as you look at your map, you're going to realize that it's Galatia and Bithynia are not cities. They are entire regions of what is now the country of Turkey. So the translation would be something like this. We wanted to go to the Great Lakes, and the Spirit of Jesus didn't allow us to. So then we tried the Rockies, and it was a hard no there as well. So we went all the way to the Pacific Northwest, and I was happy there because it's so beautiful. But then I had a dream that we were to head to Hawaii. So it's not quite that much geographic space. It's going from the Great Lakes all the way to Hawaii, but it's that same kind of, there were whole regions that we were not allowed to go into. And so we finally end up in Troas. And as I played with different websites and estimates on Google, that is many, many, many miles of no before Paul gets to a yes. Scholars that I could find on the web estimated the journey from Syrian Antioch to Troas was somewhere around 800 miles. Not counting the detours they may well have taken to try to get into these further north areas of that continent. Somewhere around 800 miles. It was like walking from Seattle to Sacramento. I have driven from Seattle to Sacramento 8 gazillion times because I went to seminary in Southern California. And it was bad enough to have to drive it. Imagine doing that walk. So Paul himself gives us a slightly different perspective on this same incident in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. In Acts, he has this dramatic dream about Macedonia, but in this reading, his reason for leaving Troas and going to Macedonia is much more prosaic. That last sentence is probably the most important sentence in any of Paul's writings, in my humble opinion. I would choose that sentence over anything in Romans, any of the more deeply theological pieces. This is the story of his life. Thanks be to God, who in Christ always leads us in triumphal procession. And we've read half of the book of Acts together, right? He was stoned and tossed out of many towns. And yet, because people had come to faith, they'd come to know the living Christ, Paul is able to say, Christ leads us in triumphal procession, and through us spreads in every place the fragrance that comes from knowing him. So underline that sentence. It's in your bulletin. Commit it to memory or stick it up in your bathroom mirror. It's a great sentence. So in 2 Corinthians, it's the same incident, And there we learn that God had already opened a door in Troas. So Paul has had 800 miles of no. And he finally gets to Troas, and there's a yes. And presumably they had been there for some time, and things were going well. And they're just great rejoicing. They are finally settling in a little bit, because they finally have a yes after hundreds of miles of no. But there's a glitch in the system, because Titus is not there as Paul expected. And I wonder what he's thinking. Does he stay in this place of fruitful ministry, or does he go off to search for his friend and colleague? Troas or Macedonia? He's got both options. Both are places God has opened a door. So the first piece of good news in this story for us is that there's often more than one right answer to a question. God opens a door in Troas. God issues an invitation to Macedonia. We cripple ourselves into thinking that our lives are always just a binary. This or that. There's always places that God will work in a multitude of ways, as we are the fragrance of Christ wherever we are. And we're also talking a relatively short distance here from Troas to Macedonia. Troas is on the far western edge of Asia, and Macedonia is on the eastern edge of Europe. You can see that as you look at your map. And our map, the one that you have in your bulletin, shows him taking a sea journey across from Troas into Philippi. But having been, not too long ago, in the city of Istanbul, I had a question about this. Our map shows a sea journey, but I think it's entirely possible they detoured just up north to cross an inlet in the Aegean Sea that is much, much shorter. It's a much cheaper, easier route to take. And so I don't have one single biblical text except for this, none of it. But in my imagination, this makes a lot of sense. This inlet is now known as the Bosphorus Strait. And it's a crossing roughly equivalent to the crossing from Edmonds to Kingston. You've done that crossing. You get out there in the middle and you can see all the mountains. It's worth doing just to go mountain watching. So this strait is not all that wide. It runs through the middle of the city of Istanbul. Istanbul is on both sides. Istanbul is in Europe and Istanbul is in Asia. And for just a very few dollars and about 20 minutes each way, you can cross from Europe to Asia and back again, all before lunch, which I know because I have done that very journey. And Turkish lunches are amazing, that Mediterranean food, oh my gosh. So Paul and his companions could reverse their journey. They could reverse course if they wanted to. There were ways to return to Troas. There were ways to return to Asia. But the story tells us that he does cross over. He crosses over. Did I give you the picture? Yes. Did you get the picture of the boat? Yes. I can't remember if that's the Blue Mosque or the Hagia Sophia, but because there are these two beautiful mosques that are right next to each other on the waterfront. And the boats just take off from there. It is astoundingly historic. All right, moving on. This first piece, more than one right answer. Second piece is that Paul has really good people with him in either place. In Troas, he has his co-pastor Silas, and it's also in Troas that scholars think that Luke joined the party. because it is here that the Acts narrative switches from using the word they to using the word we. So potentially this Greek physician, Luke, has joined forces and begins to travel with Paul and his entourage and all the way back to Jerusalem. But Titus isn't with him. He has these really good friends. He has a good team in place. But Titus is not there. And somehow Paul believes that he might be on the other side of the decision, that Titus might be in Macedonia. So there is good reason to go there as well. Troas, Macedonia. Good and good. God and God. How to choose. And the answer is our verse. Thanks be to God, who always leads us in triumphal procession, spreads in every place the fragrance that comes from knowing him. The will of God for us is that always and everywhere we are evidence that God is still at work in the world. Do our choices give glory to God? Do our relationships reflect the profound love that Christ has for all people? Are we looking for ways to serve those we love and those we don't? Are we the fragrance of Christ in a world that smells to high heaven? It has been a hard week in our country. It matters that we become this fragrance, because the one who sits at the right hand of God in the highest heaven has sent us to be his witnesses in this smelly, broken world. Therefore, it is within this broadest of mandates that we discern the particulars of our lives. If we're not being transformed by Christ and participating with him in the work of redeeming the world, the rest of it seldom even makes sense. We can go to the perfect school. We can get the perfect job. We can marry the perfect spouse and live in paradise. And the core of our lives will still be missing without Christ. On the other hand, we can have to go to our third choice safety school and then find ourselves perhaps seriously underemployed, married to another human being instead of a saint. That's always a shock to many of us. It was a special shock to Dave. He's like, oh, man. We can find ourselves living in the city, maybe in a little more rundown, dangerous part of the city, instead of living on a tropical island. But we also can know great contentment in those places, those choices we did not want to make, because we are seeking to honor Christ in all that we do, wherever we are. I just think that is very hopeful news. God is not nearly so concerned with the particular place we are in as he is in the kind of people we are being in that place. There's often more than one right place we can be. But having said that, there are some guidelines that we can pull out of our text that will help us in our decision making. It can help us narrow down the possibilities. The first guideline is to make choices that are consistent with our personalities, our interests, our gifts, and our abilities. We see Paul choosing between two places to go as an evangelist and teacher. He was not deciding between ministry and a career as a physicist. His interests, his gifts, his abilities did narrow down his options somewhat. His previous education, his life experience, his circle of community. There are so many jobs that I am not suited for. I'm so grateful that people in churches have allowed me to be their pastor. my first job out of college, I was a bank teller at the Rainier branch of what's now the Bank of America. Have I told you this story? I'm a bank teller, and I was the drive-up teller. So part of what sank my ship is that meant I could have coffee in my station all day long. And by the time I realized I was drinking 10 cups of coffee a day, I could realize why I was slightly irritated about my job, and I pulled that back. But one day, I had this lovely client who came every week. He drove the Hostess Twinkie delivery truck in my part of Ballard, and he always sent me something like a Twinkie or a something, and he'd had a really good week, whatever that meant in his world, and so he sent me a 6-pack of Ding Dongs. Do you remember Ding Dongs? They're about this big, round, and about this thick. They're heavy, and 6 of them are really heavy, and he put it in the pneumatic tube, and it got jammed. And my boss comes up to my window and he goes, "I'm not calling maintenance. You are going to have to call maintenance and explain to them why there are ding-dongs in your station." And so, we carried on, and because I was at the drive-up, I had a kind of a given clientele set of people who always came through the drive-up. Do you remember when we did that? You had to get cash at a drive-up. It was before machines. Which tells me how old I am. And I would get involved in the conversation. The pet store lady brought me a different dog or cat or something every day to say hi. And the fishermen would come back from their catches and they'd be cashing these huge checks. And I got taken out to dinner a couple of times. It was really quite lovely. And so anyway, but because I was chatting, it became clear to me that I needed a job where talking to people was the point. Because my boss comes in and he says to me, and I was always off by just like a penny or a dime, he goes, "If you could just balance once a week, it would be easier to keep you on." And so I finished out my year. I tried so hard, but I wasn't great at counting pennies when I was saying hi to the new puppy at the pet store. So I do not have any possibility of a future career in banking. Although my father was a vice president at this bank. He had been in the Air Force when he retired. He went to work for Rainier Bank. National Bank of Commerce became Rainier Bank, became Bank of America. I don't know what it is now. But it was not in my gene pool anywhere. That's my story of how I came to be a minister and not a bean counter. Paul is also choosing because of what capabilities he does have and what capabilities he doesn't have. There are some careers we're ill-suited for or would be miserable doing. There are people we would be really unhappy married to, projects we aren't skilled to take on, some things we just cannot do or would do so poorly that we would be much better off leaving them to someone more gifted. And so while we're always invited to be open to growth, we're invited to try new areas, there are natural parameters that surround each one of us. So we do have choices, but there are also some parameters that shape them. Secondly, our circumstances will shape and influence our options. In the early verses of the Acts text, we're told the Holy Spirit forbade Paul to speak in Asia and did not allow him to go in Bithynia. My question about those texts is, what did God know that Paul didn't? What protection was God offering with these baffling obstructions? On this journey alone, Paul experienced 800 miles worth of closed doors. Some of you in your life know what that felt like. When you're in a place where you just haven't gotten to yes yet. And the hope that this text gives us, all of us, is that the closed doors in our lives can be just as much a direct means of guidance as the open ones. Sometimes we're called to wait patiently before a closed door, waiting for it to open, working steadily towards a goal, even if it seems impossible or a long ways off. And again, I look at our physician back in the corner. You know, when you start out pre-med, the end of your last residency is years and years. Is it 12 years? Is that what we said, Shirley?
Yeah.
It's a long ways off, but worth pursuing. There are other times when a closed door is a good indicator that we are to move on or look in another direction. Perhaps that particular door has been closed, so we will look elsewhere. Our circumstances can be used by God to guide us, and very often we are surprised by the outcome. The third guideline for us is to remember that it isn't all about us, or even primarily about us. We are to be the fragrance of Christ to the world, the smelly, needy, broken world. God does call us to make Christ known wherever we are, but that doesn't mean we can hide in our safety zone and just talk about Christ to each other. The invitation in Paul's story, in his journeys, is that Christ asks us to go into situations where people are in great need, to feed the hungry, to heal the sick, to love those whom nobody loves. And there's one final guideline. Well, there's probably more. There's one final one I saw this week. The commitments we have already made have to impact our future commitments. In 2 Corinthians, we see Paul making a major decision simply based on his commitment to Titus. They've gone out as a team into a territory that is hostile. And Paul is uneasy because he doesn't know that Titus is alive and well and not lost in a Roman prison somewhere or left for dead by the side of the road. He's made a commitment to Titus, and he follows that commitment, looking to know that this co-pastor of his is well. So our commitments have to have the same impact on us. We can choose to marry or not, but once we're married, our other decisions must be shaped out of love and consideration for our spouse, knowing that when that relationship is painful, is abusive, that's where redemption and new life comes in. The same thing, we honor our spouse if we made that commitment. We honor our children. We have an increasing ability that Paul's people did not have to decide about having children. But once we're the parents, their welfare has to shape our decisions. Certainly there's forgiveness and redemption when we cannot keep those commitments safely. There's also a lot of creativity in how we keep our commitments. Who knew that Zoom would become such a powerful connection and a powerful strategy for families to stay together? We never Zoomed before the pandemic, but now it's something that it just connects all of us in great ways. There's creativity for how we keep in touch. One of the great turning points of our marriage was when Dave and I discovered we could keep a shared Google Calendar, right? So our schedules are in sync, or at least we know where the other person is. And this was most especially important back when Dave traveled so much. It was hard for me to keep track of what part of the world he was in. I follow my kids' lives on Instagram. I know more about where my kids are and what they're doing because I follow them than they would hate it if I called them every day and said, so what'd you do today, right? But I can plug in and go, that looked like fun. There are lots of creative ways to sustain our commitments, but this text tells us that our commitments do shape what we do next. And I wonder, what might Paul have done differently if Titus had a cell phone and they could have checked in across the miles? So we have options. But the bottom line is simply that we find ways to keep our promises, to care for each other, because that is a truly exotic fragrance in this world. I invite you to join me in this prayer up on the screen. Oh God, many of us are facing weighty decisions, and all of us are making daily choices that give so much flavor and fragrance to life. Guide us according to your word, and shape us into the kind of people you want us to be, so that we are the fragrance of Christ, always and everywhere. Guide our church in making choices so that we are the fragrance of Christ here in our town. And the people of God said together, Amen.